Hi, I'm Nick Powell, City Hall Bureau Chief with City and State. Joining me on today's City and State TV is City Councilman Jimmy Van Bramer. He represents parts of Queens. Thank you for joining me today, Jimmy.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to talk about your op-ed that you wrote in the Daily News on your experience growing up homeless, or I guess had a little bit of period of your life where you were homeless with your family. And I'm interested in, I want to go into a little bit of the backstory, but first I'm curious, what was the impetus for putting your story out there and really kind of raising this issue on another level?
Well, first of all, thank you for saying that about the piece. I obviously have always known that story. My father often tells the story within the family, the opening of the article. And I was in a meeting with the Deputy Mayor, Lillian Barrios Paoli, and the Department of Homeless Services Commissioner, Gilbert Taylor, and some council members talking about the crisis in New York City, right? Over 55,000 people homeless, 24,000 children homeless in the city of New York today as we speak in the 5 boroughs. And talking a little bit about what we can do, what the city is doing, and some of the negative reaction that had come out of some of the facilities in Queens. And really it was a call to conscience for all of us to step up and speak out and do what we could to both destigmatize and dispel stereotypes and try and come up with solutions. And as I sat in the meeting, I of course kept thinking about my own story, and I had not shared that publicly with anyone outside of my family and a couple of very close friends. But after the meeting, I went up to the deputy mayor and I pulled her aside and I told her about my family, and I said maybe I could share it and it could help others. And she said, if you chose to do that, I think that would be very powerful. And I over the next few days, I wrote it and I liked it, and I thought it could be helpful because very few people would think that me and my family were homeless, and our story is not unlike the story of others. So I wrote it, talked to my parents obviously about publishing it, and luckily they approved of doing it, and it's had a great reaction, what I intended it and hoped it would.
Now, you had said you obviously heard the story, your dad tell the story before. When you decided to publish it, did you, I'm assuming you circled back with your father, were there parts of the story that you hadn't heard? Were there parts that he told you that were kind of eye-opening to you?
There were a lot of things that I hadn't heard before. I knew the part where he and my family go in and he needed a bottle of milk for me, for example, but I didn't know the story of how we got out. One of the parts of the story is this other guy who was in the shelter, who was an ex-con, helped my father and told my dad that if he could find a place, he would drive us to it. And my dad said to me over the phone, he gave me a little bit of hope. And when my dad said that on the phone, I got chills, literally. And I said, Dad, you don't even know how profound, you sounded just now when you said that. And I knew when he said that to me, that would be really what I would center the piece around, which was that the piece, our story, hopefully would provide some inspiration to people who are currently in that predicament, and ultimately that's why my parents agreed that we should tell the story, because even though both felt a little hesitant in some ways to share it, they believed that it might be helpful to others who are in a situation that we were once in, and if that was what we could accomplish, they wanted to do it.
Now, the underlying message, at least for that, one of the takeaways that I had was that it's kind of putting a new face to homelessness, and kind of trying to debunk some of the stigma around the various people who within the homeless population. Was that something that you had intended to do, or was it just something that kind of came naturally out of the story?
It came out of the experience, I definitely intended to do it. I mean, the truth is that nearly half of the people who are homeless in our shelters work. And I'm not sure that many people know that or would think that about those who are homeless. So almost half are getting up every day, going to work. They just simply can't afford the rent. They can't make that jump into permanent, stable housing. When I talked to my dad, I asked him if he was working at the time. And he said he was, right? He was a journeyman pressman for the Times, working intermittently, but working. And so I wanted to include that in the story because I want people to know that there are plenty of homeless people who are working, who are trying to work their way back into stable housing and out of homelessness. I wanted to dispel the myths and stereotypes. We were in the shelter for 6 weeks. I think some people think that people are homeless forever. And I wanted to make sure that people understood that the families who are homeless desperately, for the most part, want to get out of shelter into permanent housing, into the neighborhoods that they want to be in, where their kids are going to school. People are aspirational, right? They want the best for their children. So our stay in the shelter was 6 weeks. Unfortunately, people are staying longer because of the affordability crisis that we're also dealing with in the city. But people want to get out of shelter. They want to work. They want what's best for their children. And I wanted to dispel some of the stereotypes that are out there.
Now, within the story, you also mention some of the, I guess, conflicts, not maybe conflicts, but the issues around some of the homeless shelters within Queens. You mentioned the Elmhurst, the Pan Am shelter in Elmhurst, and then I understand there's also the Westway shelter. There's a lot of kind of debate around, are they becoming overcrowded? Is it spilling out onto the streets in the form of higher crime rates? Could you kind of outline what's going on with these shelters and how that pertains to kind of the overall homelessness problem in the city?
Well, look, I think we have a crisis in the city that we cannot turn away from. And I think the administration and really all of us have to be a part of the solution. And with 55,000 people homeless, 24,000 children, clearly we have a moral obligation, and quite frankly, we have a legal obligation to house those families in the city of New York. And the administration is rightly attacking this head on, trying to get these families emergency shelter when they need it and more permanent housing when it is possible. So what we saw in some of those protests were incredibly ugly scenes where children who are homeless through no fault of their own were being shouted at, some really horrible things. And we don't want that to happen. We can't have that to happen. And that can only happen when people view homeless people as other, as people that we don't have to worry about or don't have to care about. And the truth is, as humans, we have an obligation to care about all of those families. So the administration, I believe, is working hard to tackle this. And clearly we need communication with all of the stakeholders who are affected when there is a shelter that is cited based on an emergency basis. But I want to be part of this solution, and I think all of us have to be called to conscience and step forward. And obviously, because I have a very personal history with this issue, I have no choice but to speak up and try and de-escalate some of the tensions that are out there, and also shed light on this so that people see this as a human crisis and not as something that simply is going to attack their sense of security or their livelihoods, but instead maybe and hopefully affect their hearts as well, so that we see these children who are in these shelters, whether it be on Queens Boulevard or Astoria Boulevard, as all of our children, and it is all of our obligation to make sure they're safe, they're secure, and that they are on a path to stable housing.
When you revisited the story with your father, I'm curious if you got into at all the conditions of the shelter, because obviously the Times did that big series last year that got a lot of play about Dasani Coates and her experience at the Auburn shelter in Brooklyn. But did you have any conversation there? And I'm curious if since you've been monitoring the issue, if you feel that there's been a change since from back then to now.
Well, look, I was shocked by some of the things that my father told me about that shelter, rats in the room, and he said, look, it was a dangerous place back then. I believe that currently the shelter system is better. It is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. I don't think anyone would say that it is. But we all know that shelters, whether they be emergency shelters or otherwise, are not the ideal place to have families living and children being raised. That's the whole point, right? To both prevent homelessness before it occurs, and then when we have children and families in shelter, to get them out and into stable housing as soon as possible. So it's challenging. It's an incredible challenge that we are all faced with, and every administration is faced with, making sure that the facilities that we do have are as safe, secure, clean as possible, and when they aren't meeting the standards, that needs to be fixed right away. Clearly the Times shed a huge light on the issue. Our experience was quite some time ago, so my hope is that the families at the Pan Am have a much different situation than the one that my family experienced.
Sure. Now, talking about the numbers, obviously we've seen an uptick in the last 5 years, I think by 52%, 54%. And recently, according to the recent stats, it's up even 6% since January. Are there enough pathways out of homelessness for that population right now? I mean, the mayor provided with some rental subsidy programs in the recent budget, but is that enough? And what should we be doing more?
Right. Well, I think the key to all of this is preventing homelessness before it even begins. And I think the administration has done a lot to increase their home base operations. I think they've doubled the amount of people they can serve there. I think catching families who are struggling before they fall through the cracks is really what we have to do. So I think where the administration has doubled those efforts, we need to continue to increase them. And then I think clearly working with the state, who has a big piece of this, increasing subsidies that are going to allow those families to get out of the shelter system. Because even if in some cases, and there are cases where both parents are working with their kids living in shelter, they still can't come up with the money to put the down payment on the apartment to get into that apartment. So the subsidy has to be there to actually give that family that chance to get out of homelessness and into stable housing. So it's a multi-pronged effort. It's a multi-agency effort. This is not just DHS, right? This is so many other agencies, HPD, ACS, NYCHA, all coming together with a laser focus. And I think this really has to be a war room type effort to make sure that these families are getting the resources, the wraparound services that they need to get back on their feet, which is where they want to be, which is what they're striving to do. We can do that if there's the political will and, quite frankly, the moral indignation about inequality, poverty, and homelessness that I believe exists in this administration and in this progressive moment.
And in talking with Deputy Mayor Barrios Paoli, do you get a sense that synergy that's needed between those agencies is there? I mean, these are obviously, agencies on their own that are, huge and sometimes very bureaucratic and,
Sure.
and lots of red tape. So getting them all on the same page, is that something you feel confident about?
Yeah, I mean, first I want to say one of the things that drew me to this was Lillian Barrios Pioli. She was deeply affected by what happened on Queens Boulevard, and I could see that. She was emotional about it, and she's been working in the city for a long time in a number of agencies. I've always thought highly of her, but I was particularly moved by how emotional she was about this issue, and so I know that she wants to make this right, and that she's going to convene all these agencies. And of course, it flows from Mayor de Blasio too. But I know and believe with all my heart, because I saw in her face, and I heard her words talking about this issue, talking about those families, not in some bureaucratic speak, but as a human being who really cares deeply about people who are struggling and about these children who I think all of us feel an obligation to care for. So she was part of why I wanted to write this story, because of how deeply she moved me. And so I believe very much that she's committed to this, that the administration is committed to this, and I believe the council is as well. And I think the speaker also talked at that meeting about how we all needed to be a part of the solution and take this on. And obviously, you know, I decided to do that in a big way.
And now, finally, to wrap up, are there any actions that the council can take to kind of supplement or, I guess, enhance the city's efforts to combat the homelessness problem?
Well, you know, I think we have funded a ton of programs in this budget that really target at-risk families and at-risk populations. I think you have seen a renewed commitment to NYCHA from the City Council, and NYCHA has a role to play in this struggle as well. So through our funding initiatives, we have seen an increase in resources allocated to those who are most in need, and I think that you will continue to see that from a progressive council that cares deeply about all New Yorkers and who is committed to fighting this crisis of inequality. So the numbers that you cited, the increase in homeless, is also about a more honest approach to the crisis that we're facing, and not trying to hide either the numbers or the people, but to actually address the numbers and save and help the people who are in need. That's what I believe we're all committed to.
All right. Queens Councilman Jimmy Van Bramer, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.